Thank everyone for coming. I'm flattered that you're here to listen.
This is quite a turnout. We were in Pasadena last night, and there was 22 people and a three-legged dog. Like all of Mark's books, I'll just open the way I did last night. I dog-ear them and underline them and study them, and this is my second reading of the book, and I got so much more out of it on the second reading, and I encourage everyone to read it twice. But if you can't, just read it once. The detail is staggering. The characters in it are heartbreaking, and the violence and the description of battle is some of the most disturbing stuff I've ever read. And it's all real, and it's like sometimes just too much to take, and you have to close the book and say, okay, I'm going to get back to this. But
in a good way.
But in a great way, and also heroic people, heroic situations in a crazy time, which, you know, I finished the book and just thought, this is almost like the Battle of Hue was almost a description of hell, you know. These guys on both sides were in this rainy, kind of grim, dusty, disgusting smelling place for 30 plus days.
Shooting at one another.
You know, ending up getting shot for no reason. And anyway, it's an amazing piece of work, and I might read it a third time, Mark. But I noticed a lot of young people out there. So I had a question last night. How can a younger generation connect with a story about Vietnam, which is, to them, probably pretty historical, you know, or ancient, dare I say.
Yeah, like me.
Yeah, where I can connect because my dad grew up in that generation, you know, and I heard all the stories. And what do you think?
Well, my goal whenever I write a book is not just to write the book for people who come to it already interested in the subject matter. I try to tell a compelling story. And, you know, in the old days as a newspaper reporter, the goal was to get the reader to go to what we called the jump. You know, newspaper stories would begin on the front page if you were lucky, and then it would jump you to an inside page, and you had to try and grab the attention of the reader in those first 2 or 3 paragraphs, enough to get them to turn to inside page A17 to pick up the bulk of your story. And, you know, that's a goal that I have in anything that I write. I think if I'm going to write a 600-page book about something, it damn well better hold your interest, or you're never going to get to the end. So I think any person who likes a good story, and in this case who, you know, enjoys learning about history at the same time that they're gripped by a compelling story, you know, I hope that they'll get all the way through it and be glad they did.
Yeah, great. When I met Mark years ago doing Black Hawk Down, he said a few things to me that I really took to heart. One was, I think you should be professional, Ken, when I was bitching about things and complaining. And another was, always be working on your most difficult project. I asked this last night, but I'll ask it again.
You can ask this. You don't have to tell us that you asked the people.
I asked it last night, guys. Was this your most difficult project, most daunting? Did you ever lose sleep, or did you just go, I've done this? Here's my other question. Was Black Hawk Down and Guess of the Ayatollah a dress rehearsal for this book? You know?
Well, in a way, I mean, I think that the prospect of writing a book about a month-long battle, Black Hawk Down was about a firefight that lasted 18 hours and involved, you know, maybe 100 American soldiers and, you know, many more Somalis. But the Battle of Hue, you know, took place in a city of 140,000 people, and there were literally tens of thousands of American troops and Vietnamese troops and many, many civilians who were caught up in it. And unlike Black Hawk Down, which, as I said, was 18 hours long, this is like a month. And so, and I'd never been to Vietnam. I don't speak Vietnamese. And I wanted to tell the story through the eyes of both the Americans and the Vietnamese. So yes, you know, when I started thinking about doing this, as is often the case, my thought was, how in the world am I ever going to do this?
Yeah.
But you know, that I've learned through all the reporting I've done with newspapers and the books that I've written, that that's normal. That you really don't know how to report a story until you start. Because every story is different, and every story you have to sort of figure out how to find the people that you need to talk to and where to go for documentary information and how to get to Vietnam and how to hire somebody who can translate for you and guide you around, and you just begin doing it. And I think if there's, the only difference is that now I've done it often enough that I don't panic quite as much. I feel like, I recognize these feelings of confusion, and I know that I'm generally able to solve the problems as I go forward. So,
Right.
but yes, it is the most ambitious book.
Did your editor ever say, "Where's that book? It's been 5 years"?
No, I deliver my books early.
Oh.
I do.
Okay.
But part of that trick is you promise to deliver it, much longer period of time than you think you need.
Right.
So he's always very surprised that I deliver my book early, but I figure, well, this will take me 4 years, and I tell him, well, it's going to take me 6.
Right.
And if he gets it in 5, he thinks he's got it early.
That's so clever. I always promise scripts way before they're ready.
Yeah, well, you learn that, the plumbers who come work in your house,
Yeah.
if they estimate really high, you're really pleased when they come in low.
Right. I noticed in the book, the Vietnam, the soldiers on both sides of the war had a very narrow viewpoint of what was going on because they took orders, they were running across the street, they were going to a house.
Yeah.
Have you gotten any comments after they've read the book, the guys who are still alive, of, oh my God, I had no idea that was going on around me?
Yeah, I mean, from everyone. All of the participants who I interviewed, who I've talked to since, have said, my God, I learned so much.
Right.
And also there were things that I never understood, why this was happening or why we were ordered to do this. And now I kind of understand. And they all remark also on the perspective of the Vietnamese, the Viet Cong and the NVA. And they were particularly fascinated to learn, as anyone would be, I think, who it was who was trying to kill them, for all those months, and why were they trying to kill them. And I think, you don't have to agree with the motivations of the Vietnamese that you read about in the book, but you do better understand who they are and what they were thinking and why they did what they did. So yeah, I've been very flattered by the reaction I've gotten from these guys.
And where was your starting point for this book? Like, you said, okay, I'm going to do a book about the Battle of Hue. Where do I begin? Who do I talk to? I know you say you read everything first.
I start reading, yeah. I collect. In this case, there were several books that had been written about the Battle of Hue. One of them is called Fire in the Streets by Eric Hamill, a book called The Battle of Hue by Keith Nolan, and one or two others.
Oh yeah, Keith Nolan.
Yeah, your cousin Keith.
Oh, yeah.
And but what I found, and this is often the case with books that are written on military subjects, is that they were written by people who write primarily for a military audience. And you can recognize that right away because they need to detail the name and number and unit designation of every single character every time they come into the story.
Right.
And exactly what the weapon was that they were using and how it was modified, whatever.
Yeah.
And the other thing that they do is they don't show much interest in telling the story from both sides. It's very narrowly focused. And I knew that was not the kind of book I wanted to write. But you get a lot of useful information. It was a good place to start because I would get sort of a general introduction to the battle, and I would make lists of names of people who I could talk to and the units that they're involved with. And nowadays, because of the internet, the various units who fought in Hue, and this would be true of any unit that fought in Vietnam, they have websites. And you can go to their websites, and I would find the names of people who fought with Fox 25 or Alpha 11. And, I start working my way into the story in that way. But to be honest, the very first interview that I did for this book was with Gene Roberts, who was at the time the New York Times bureau chief in Vietnam, who happened to be the first reporter on the scene in Hue after the city was taken. He flew into the MACV compound with the first company of Marines who came in to reinforce. And Gene, as it happens, was my editor at the Philadelphia Inquirer. He hired me in 1979, and I knew he was a great editor. As editor of the Inquirer, the paper won, I think, 17 Pulitzer Prizes in 18 years. It's just an unmatched achievement. So I had he held him in very high regard as an editor. And I kind of suspected he was a good reporter back somewhere in the past, but I didn't know. I honestly didn't know that he had reported from this battle until I ran into him in New York 6 years ago. And he said, what you working on? And I said, well, I'm going to write a book about the Battle of Hue. And he said, I was there. And so it's just purely accidental. So I said, well, I'm coming to talk to you then. And that was the first interview that I did. And as it happened, as I learned more about the battle, it was really striking to me how wrong the military high command was, what General Westmoreland and General La Hue in Fubai, and their version of what was going on in Hue was wrong. And that becomes a very important theme, in the book. But at the same time that they were delivering misinformation, Gene Roberts and some of the other reporters who made it to Hue were writing stories about what was actually happening, and were getting it right. So it was a real stark illustration to me of the importance of an independent press.
Right.
Because if you read only General Westmoreland's assessment of this battle, you would think, there were no more than 400, 500 enemy troops in the city, and they were pretty easy to put down, and nothing serious happened there. And it turns out, I think this was probably the bloodiest single battle of the Vietnam War.
Yeah, that's interesting that there were all these reporters there, and the reporters really turned the American perception of what was going on in that battle and maybe in the war. So it is interesting to me that people like Gene Roberts, who just kind of showed up and got on it, said, what's going on? Oh, there's a battle in Hue. I'm going. This small group of people made a huge difference.
Right, and it's a mistake that the American military will not repeat again. But they basically allowed journalists in Vietnam to go wherever they wanted to go, as long as they could get military transport. So they, just as you say, Gene heard there was a big fight brewing in Hue, and he jumped on a helicopter with a bunch of Marines who were, as I said, the first company to come in and reinforce at the MACV compound, and found himself at ground zero in what was apparent to him, a situation where the city had fallen into enemy hands completely, except for this one little compound where he was with a bunch of Marines who were surrounded, and who really at that point couldn't get more than about a half block out. And he sort of pieced together, really in the first few hours that he was there, that this was really a serious situation, that the city had been taken, and that the Americans were outnumbered, and that this was a very serious fight. And this was, again, at the same time that General Westmoreland is saying to everyone, there's nothing going on there.
Right.
And he was saying that for weeks.
Right.
So it really was a kind of a stark illustration of what journalists did in the war.
Yeah, I just think it's amazing that a few people can make a huge difference. And in the book, you say Gene Roberts is there, and he said, "Oh my God, I've got a scoop here. I've got a huge story." And then he has to go find a typewriter, and a soldier says, "Well, I'll go with you. I saw some down at the high school." And they get shot at, and they run into this school, and they grab the typewriter. He's like, "Yeah, I got it." And then he starts typing, and it's all in Vietnamese. Oh, God.
True story.
Yeah. As a reporter, what is that burning drive where he said, I got to get this story back to the United States? Is it I want to tell the truth? Is it ego? Is it?
No, you want to tell people what's going on. And also, I think if you've done it long enough, you recognize this is a big story.
Right.
Because what we're all being told is one thing, and what I've just discovered is something completely different, and it's kind of a big deal.
Yeah.
And so what you want to do is you want to get out, write that story, and get it in the paper. So I don't want to exaggerate the role that journalists play in this book. They're a relatively small part of the story, but it was my initial step into the story, and it turned out to be a lot more significant than I imagined.
Okay, then back to the soldiers. I seem to remember in the first copy of the book you sent me, there was a prologue where some guy standing up, he said, "Yeah, my friend Bill died," and the guy says, I'm still here, you a-hole. Can I say that? Was it, did I read that wrong? Was that in your book?
No, it was in my book. Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, and here's what that refers to.
Okay.
And anyone here, we should ask: are there veterans of Vietnam veterans here?
All right.
Alpha 1-1.
All right. Well, thank you especially for coming. And if I'm wrong about something, you have my permission to throw something at me, but not my book. If that's heavy and it would
too
hurt.
heavy. Maybe the book
But,
about football.
I think that
Thin.
you would agree with me because Marines and soldiers who fought in Vietnam went for either a year or 13 months. They kept their short time calendar. On the day they were due to come out, they came out. Whether they were in a rice paddy somewhere or fighting in the middle of Hue, they jumped on a helicopter. So what happened was they fought with these guys in their units for months, got to know them really well, up until the day when they were evacuated, when they went home. And, I don't know, most 18, 19-year-old guys are not real diligent about writing down the name and address and phone number of people's parents and things like that.
Right.
And so a lot of these guys, when they came back, never saw the guys who they fought with, until, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, the internet has played a tremendous role in reconnecting veterans who probably, in many cases, reunited and hadn't seen each other for 20, 30 years. Yeah. And so, I think in this one case, there were many instances where someone was wounded and carried off the field, and the assumption was that he was dead. Because you would look sometimes and think there's no way this person is going to make it, right? And so in many cases, there was an assumption that someone had died, and there would be a reunion, and somebody would stand up to toast their buddy who fell on the battlefield, and he's in the crowd, and he says, well, I didn't die, you idiot, I'm sitting right here.
Oh, gosh.
That happened more than once.
There's so many great characters in this book. I call them characters, but people. There's Big Ernie Cheatham, the colonel.
Yeah.
Are there any other people who stick out in your mind as when you wrote it, this is tough to write, or wow, I'm really enjoying getting into this person's life, or just as you get into their life, sometimes you read a page and you're really into this guy, he's dead the next page,
Yeah.
It's
Well,
tragic.
and I made an effort in everyone that I write about to flesh them out as people, so that it doesn't register with you as a reader that this is just a faceless name, person who just got killed. It's actually a human being with a family and a life, and so that does happen. There are so many characters who I found very moving, and one of whom, Frank Dozema, was Frank was from Michigan, near Kalamazoo, and he had enrolled in the Army in a program that allowed him to serve just 2 years because he wanted to get his service out of the way. And he ended up in Vietnam initially as a radio operator, teamed with this fantastic guy, Captain Jim Coolican, who's a really important character in the story. And Frank, after 6 months, was rotated into what was considered to be a rear position, which was the MACV compound in Hue. Hue was a place where there had been very little fighting. So it was considered to be kind of a safe spot. And he was there the night that the MACV was attacked and the city fell, and is given credit for preventing the MACV compound from being overrun. And he was killed. So, he's introduced fairly early in the book. He would write these great letters home and about, what he planned to do when he got home and what was going on there in Hue. And so you kind of get to know him, and he's probably who you're thinking of. And then all of a sudden he's gone. And I think that was the nature of the experience in Vietnam. You would get to know somebody. In fact, a lot of the guys would say after a while they did not want to get to know the guys in their unit because they didn't want to have to deal with their death.
Yeah, it's just so heartbreaking. The guy we're talking about would write letters home. I can't wait to get home and fix the roof over the barn because that's going to help with the crops next year. And I want to get my diploma so I can help. I just had plans to live on this farm the whole time.
Right.
And there's even a picture of him. And I'm like, well, this guy's going to be fine because here's these letters home.
Right.
And then you almost hear third hand, you know, like Frank's dead.
Yeah.
And I just went, oh God, it's just terrible.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of heartbreaking moments in the book.
But let me talk about Ernie Cheatham for a minute.
Please, yeah. Please,
Ernie Cheatham was one of my favorite characters in the book. He was a lieutenant colonel, the commander of a battalion, and he and his battalion were fighting south of the city when the Tet Offensive occurred and Hue was taken. And his battalions are made up of like 4 companies of Marines. And so his Marine companies were being taken away from him and fed kind of piecemeal up into Hue, where they were getting creamed. And well, Ernie did not like his battalion being broken up, taken away from him, number one, and he certainly didn't like it when his men were getting creamed in Hue. So he came storming up to Fubai, which was the Task Force X-ray headquarters, and demanded, that he be sent up to Hue to command his men.
Now, can you physically describe him when you say he demanded? What does he look like?
Ernie was a giant. He actually played in the NFL. He played for the Steelers and the Baltimore Colts. And he was actually traded from the Steelers to the Baltimore Colts, as he said, for a helmet and a water bucket. But he was a massive guy. And he left the NFL when he realized that he didn't get paychecks anymore when the season ended. So he went back to the Marine Corps. And Ernie was the kind of commander, and we've talked a little bit about General Westmoreland, who had such a fixed idea of what was going on in the battlefield of Vietnam, that the reality of what was happening rarely intruded upon his idea of what was going on. Ernie is the opposite kind of commander. He began by realizing he did not know anything. He didn't know how many enemy troops were there. He didn't know where they were. He didn't know what kind of weapons they had. He knew only one thing, and that was that he was going to be fighting in a city. And he knew he didn't know how to do that. And so the night before he went up into Hue, he found in a trunk that his battalion sort of carted around everywhere, old Marine Corps manuals for how to fight, how to attack a fortified position, how to fight in a city. The last time Marines had fought in a city was in Seoul back in, 1952 or 53. So he spent the whole night before going up to Hue cramming, from these manuals and figuring out the kind of tactics he would need to employ and what kind of weapons he would need. And he rounded up tear gas, and he rounded up bazookas, and he rounded up recoilless rifles. These were very powerful, portable weapons, and had a strategy for how he was going to use his men and coordinate this attack. And so when Ernie got to southern Hue, his men were so relieved because they really respected him, but also they stopped dying in such large numbers because he began using them in a more intelligent way, and that was how the Marines began retaking southern Hue. Right. So I mean, to me, Ernie Cheatham is the kind of guy who, if I had to go to war, I would want to go with Ernie.
How much, I'm interested in the process of writing. How much rewriting do you do? I mean, you sent me a gallery of the book, and it's a lot different from this book.
Right.
How much rewriting do you do? How many editors are on helping you, friends, trusted associates, and how much do you leave on the cutting room floor?
I write a first draft, and I'm often rewriting while I'm writing the first draft. But when I get a first draft done, then I go back and rewrite it 3 or 4 times. And at some point in that process, I want somebody to see it, because now I've lived with it for a long time, and I have no idea whether anybody will find this readable or not. So someone like you, Ken, might get an early draft saying, what do you think, And I listen, and then I'll do rewrites on the basis of that. I turn in the manuscript to my publisher when I feel like it's in good shape. And then he goes at it. And, he often has extremely good macro suggestions, like, you need to move this section of the story to here, or this section of the story is too long, or you have too many anecdotes here, you need to lose 3 of them, or whatever, down to very fine editing, like wrong word in this sentence. You need to choose a different word. He's a very good editor. So after I've done that with Morgan Entrican as my editor, after I've polished it with his help, then it goes to the copy editors at the publishing house, and they're very good at things like grammar, and they find repetition. And we also, for this book, hired a fact checker who would do things like try to check every place name, every person's name. If I write about someone who was killed, they can go to the Vietnam virtual wall online, and there you'll find the names of all the Americans who were killed in the Vietnam War with the date that they were killed and where they were from. And it's an extremely useful research tool. So the fact checkers kind of backstop everything for me. And all through that process, every time I get my hands on the manuscript, I'm rewriting.
Right.
And I basically continue rewriting until they pry it from my hands and tell me I have to stop.
Right.
Because, and for that reason, I very rarely read my own books or articles, because it really bugs me to be reading something I wrote and I think, oh, damn, I want to change that.
Right.
I don't like the way this sentence is written, and it's too late. I can't do it anymore.
Yeah, and you told me on the phone you are listening to this book on tape.
Yeah.
And pulling over to jot down in your car to jot down corrections for the paperback version.
Well, with this book, because it's done really well, and so it's gone back for 5 or 6 printings now, and every time it goes back for a printing, I can make corrections. And of course, when a book goes public and everybody can buy it and read it, you begin hearing from everybody in the world who knows more about what you just wrote about than you do. And they're pointing out, well, this is all wrong, or you got this name wrong. And I'm accepting these corrections. And because the book goes back for reprinting, I've been able to make a lot of corrections and fixes.
Right.
And so that's why I say, if you want the most accurate version of the book, get the paperback, which will come out next year.
Next year.
It won't change dramatically from what's there now.
A question about the battle. There's a Vietnamese term I'm going to butcher. Vào That Long Dich, which Google translates as into belt reverse. Please explain to the audience why this is such a big deal in this battle, that the Viet Cong had faced the soldiers in Hue. What does that mean?
Well, you hear this a lot from the Vietnamese fighters. The great advantage that America had in the war was air power and artillery. And air power is too dangerous to employ if you're very close to the enemy. So that expression means hold on to your enemy's belt, which means get so close to them that you can grab their belt. And if you're that close, then you're immune to artillery and air attacks, and you even the odds a little bit. And so particularly in the city of Hue, where the fighting was close in anyway, they would endeavor to stay like right across the street from wherever the American line was for as long as they could hold out, because as soon as they stepped back a block away from the American forces, then they could get hammered by artillery or air power.
Yeah, there's many scenes in this book where the American soldiers can't make out who's just across the street, and there's just hazy movement through windows and a head disappearing and someone running, and it seemed like an incredibly frustrating thing for these soldiers.
Particularly because in a city, unlike fighting in open terrain, it's very difficult to know where you're being shot at from. In an open terrain, you can orient by sound, and you can see some flashes, of gun barrels, and so you can got to get a sense pretty quickly of where the enemy is. In a city, sound reverberates off of all the walls, and so somebody starts shooting at you, and you don't know where they're shooting at you from, and that has to be a terrifying experience, because if you don't know where it's coming from, you don't know where to get safe. And so, that was terrifying. And also because you're in a city, there's plenty of cover. So, your enemy, if they're smart, isn't going to, show you where they are or step out where you have a clear shot at them unless they absolutely have to. And frankly, that was one of the things that Ernie Cheatham decided the night before he went into Hue. In the very first days of the battle, owing to their inexperience in urban fighting, the Marine commanders were marching right down the middle of the streets. And there are pictures of this. I mean, there's a whole photo spread in Life magazine of a platoon of Marines pinned down in the middle of a wide avenue in the middle of Hue. And the Vietnamese knew that was idiotic. You want to, if you're fighting in a city, you stay off of the streets.
Right.
And if you're going to attack a house or a building, you don't go for the doors. You blow a hole in the wall and you make your own entrance, right? Because they've covered all the obvious entrances to a place. So that was, we wanted weapons like those recoilless rifles and those bazookas because they fired a very heavy round that would make a hole in a stone wall. And those became extremely useful in entering the building that you're trying to take.
Right.
And the other great thing is you've poked some holes in it, and then you could pump tear gas in, and you might be able to clear the enemy out before you cross the street. And that's what I mean about using tactics that would save his men's lives.
Right. Here's a good question. I wrote it. Whose shoulders do you stand on to write this book, Mark? Who do you look? What book inspired you? Like, I think of this as like the Moby Dick of urban battle. So it's everything. There's everything you ever want to know about whales and Moby Dick, and this is the same. Does anything like, does Hiroshima jump out at you?
Yeah, Hiroshima is a great example, but totally different kind of story. I would say first, writers like John Hersey, Gay Talese, Truman Capote, Norman Mailer to varying degrees, Joan Didion, who were writing back in the 1970s, using effectively the techniques of fiction, by which I mean developing storylines with a beginning and a middle and an end, with characters who you care about, with action and dialogue, and the way stories are written in fiction, and applying those techniques to telling a true story. And that, you began to see that being done a lot in the 1960s and 70s. But there were some terrific books kind of like this, written during World War II. There was a writer named Cornelius Ryan, who wrote A Bridge Too Far and Longest Day. And those were inspiring to me because those were also both sweeping military engagements with many, many thousands of characters, and yet he managed to make sense of it and write it in a way that would propel you as a reader, into the story. David Halberstam wrote a really good book about the Korean War called The Coldest Winter, which was a real example to me of how to write about a very sweeping subject matter with many, many different storylines and characters and make it all, make sense.
Right.
You try to learn from the writers that you admire.
Right, but then don't you sort of absorb it and just go on your own Mark Bowden like history, like, all right, I've done this for 40 years or more, so I'm pretty confident.
Yeah. Well, I am, and I feel very comfortable doing it. And so yes, and now certainly when I write, even though I've learned from a lot of other people. I'm trying things in my own writing that I haven't seen other people do. So, for instance, if I'm in a scene with a character, I've interviewed that person in depth, and I might call them back a third and a fourth time and find out, what were you thinking, or why in the world did you do this, and I'm asking often questions that people find annoying. But it's because I can't make things up. I need to know what they're thinking, and then I try to smoothly incorporate their motivations, their fears, their hopes, whatever, which develops them as people, so that you don't feel that you're just reading about a name from a certain place in Minnesota.
His rank and
it's a human being. In fact, one of the things that I did in this book, which you don't find in the accounts written by people who write primarily for military audiences, is that I don't generally identify a character in the book by rank, unless the rank is significant in some way. In which case, if it's important to know that this guy who just yelled at these guys is a colonel,
Right.
that makes a difference, whether it's a, fellow private. But I'm more interested in them as people than I am as, what rank they had or necessarily even what job description they had. I'm trying to develop them as human beings.
Right. Well, oh gosh, we've been talking for a while. One final question before we open it up. What is the takeaway of this book when you're finished? Is this, would you call it an anti-war book? Or like when we were writing Black Hawk Down, we're like, what are we saying? And the producer's like, soldiers good, policy questionable or bad.
Well,
What do we feel after this? What's happening to me?
my motivation in everything that I write is just to reach my own understanding of what happened. I am really interested to understand how and why things happen in the real world. And so I don't begin writing a book thinking, this is a message that I want to convey in writing this story. My feeling about this book is I've always been, as any of us who were alive during those years, fascinated by the whole Vietnam experience. I was too young to have been drafted or fought in Vietnam, but I was touched by it, as nearly everybody was who was alive during that time. And so throughout my life, I've been strongly interested in the war and what actually happened there. And I had, as a teenager, my own ideas about the war in Vietnam, and I was against the war like just all my friends were. But the truth is that I didn't know enough to have a strong opinion about it, and I knew that. And so for me, this was an opportunity to really explore for myself what happened there, what that experience was really like, for the people who went. And I feel I'm not the sort of person who would write a 7-volume history of the war in Vietnam. I'm a storyteller. So for me, I want to choose an important event in the middle of this bigger story and dig deeply enough that you're right down there on the street, with the guys who are risking their lives or getting killed. And you learn so much, I think, about the bigger story by digging deeply into one event. And I think you see in the Battle of Hue in this book, nearly all of the threads of the Vietnam War experience, from a military perspective, from a political perspective, from what was going on in Vietnam at the time. All of these issues come into play in this one story. So I hope the takeaway is I better understand what was going on during the Vietnam War and what that experience was like for those who went over there and fought, and maybe for the first time have some insight into the enemy,
Right.
to the Vietnamese.
Yeah.